Amen and amen.
Good morning. Hey, how's it going? Do we have any foodies in the house? Anybody foodies? Okay, 3 of you. Excellent. That's amazing. Anyone eat food? Anyone eat food in the house? Oh, full participation. Okay. I've changed dramatically the way that I've been eating the last couple of months, and but for some reason I've become addicted to watching like travel food shows. You know, where people go to other countries and eat a bunch of stuff I can't eat right now. But I love that. And my favorite new show is this show on Netflix. It's called Somebody Feed Phil. And it's about a guy named Phil Rosenthal. Phil was the creator of Everybody Loves Raymond. And so what he does is he travels around and experiences the cuisine from all of these different cities around the world. What's really interesting, though, is he bears a remarkable resemblance to an older Ryan Paulson. Huh? Isn't that crazy? Look, this is not in my notes. The eyebrows, folks, the eyebrows, the eyes, the expression. It's Ryan Paulson. So I don't know if he's leading a double life, but I do know Ryan likes to eat food, so he would do this. So he goes and explores all these different cultures and different foods, and I love that because I love that too. If I'm traveling and I go to a city, the first thing I do when I get to my hotel is I open up my favorite app, which is Yelp. And I Yelp, man. Anybody else do that? Yelp fans? Yes? I look to see what is this city known for? What's the cuisine of this city? Because a lot of larger cities, they're known for food or drink, right? We could think. I'm going to give you a few examples. If I say Chicago, what comes to mind food-wise? Pizza and hot dogs. You got it. New York. Pizza, sandwiches. The next one, Seattle. Now, just real quick before you answer, the answer is not pizza. Okay. Seattle. Coffee. Excellent. Philly. Highlands Ranch. Okay. All right. There's a Chick-fil-A. There is a Chick-fil-A in Highlands Ranch. Have you ever thought about what your city was known for? Have you ever thought about what your family was known for? Have you ever thought about what your church was known for? Well, in the last several weeks, we've been in this series called Postcards from the Edge, and we've been journeying through Revelation chapter 2 and 3. These are the 7 letters to the 7 churches from Jesus through John to who? To the churches and to us. And we've been learning some really unique things about those cities. And our hope isn't just that we have a bunch of knowledge about these cities, but that we can learn about the city and the church and figure out what does God want to say to the church at South today. Today we're diving into what's the longest of these letters. One person said it was to the most obscure churches. It's the longest and harshest letters of them all, and I get the privilege of preaching it today. So it's to the church in a place called Thyatira. That's a nice word. It's a city that's in the modern day. It's in Turkey. It's called Akhisar, and it stood about halfway between Pergamum and Sardis on this sort of flat, broad, fertile plain. And it was an ideal place for being a commercial center. As a matter of fact, there was a lot of farming, there was a lot of trades. But in 200 BC, it was set up as a protective outpost for Seleucid I to protect an invasion of his kingdom. But what's odd about that, and kind of interesting, is that usually if you set out a protective place, you want it to be like in the mountains, right? Your protected city is in the mountains, or there's some kind of natural fortification. Well, there was no natural fortification in Thyatira. It was out on an open plain. So if you didn't want people to invade you, it seems crazy that you would go to the middle of a field and say, ha, can't get me now, suckers, right? But what's cool is that the people of Thyatira, they took really seriously their responsibility to protect the city as citizen soldiers, if you will, to keep the bad things out while still allowing trade to be fertile in the city. Roman rule brought a lot of stability, it brought a lot of money, and it brought trades to the city. There were all kinds of trades, and a lot of people in the city were trades workers, like wool workers, or they people that dyed fabrics or made outer garments or leather workers or tanners or potters. Or one big thing they were really known for was being bronzesmiths. And they were also known for their purple dye. As a matter of fact, if you remember in Acts 16, Paul meets this woman named Lydia who was from Thyatira, dealing purple dyes from Thyatira. And so trade was a big industry. And in any city where it's a big industry, a great majority of the people that lived in Thyatira, they worked in the trades. It was a way of life. As a matter of fact, today, Alcazar is one of the dominant trade-leading cities in its region, still, after all of this time. So with the trades thriving, with the majority of its citizens operating in the trades, they formed labor guilds. And we kind of know what that is like. They were the part of the hub of the city life. As a matter of fact, the trade guilds, they followed a lot of the religious practices of the day. It was a very syncretistic city, which means instead of just saying we have one God, we take from a lot of different traditions, and this is sort of our religion. It's like a melting pot. And the trades followed in that. As a matter of fact, a lot of the trade guilds actually met in a temple, and the locals honored this god named Tyrannius, which was a combination of characteristics from various different gods of various different cultures. And the guilds would meet in these temples of pagan worship, and they would have their meetings, but it wasn't all just following Robert's Rule of Order. I mean, they partied, and when I say partied, I mean they got down hard. They ate a lot. If somebody feeds Phil, if he went there, he would have stuffed himself. But what he might have been surprised by is that everyone slept with each other after the meal. A little bit strange, and I did not see that on Somebody Feeds Phil, so no worries, you can still watch it. I would recommend binge watching the show sometime around 4:30 tonight. Just a thought. Just kidding. Man, what a sharp. So religion and work was inseparably linked. And people that worked did these practices as a part of just the kind of the melting pot religion of the day. And it's into that world that this new church was planted, the Church of Thyatira. If you were a church planter, can you imagine saying, here's what I know about this city. Everybody sleeps together. Religion and work is all sort of blended together. Let's go plant a church. That'd be an interesting experiment. It's really cool, though, to know that budding community that was planted in the first century existed all the way up until 1922, when Orthodox Christians were deported. That's cool. Can you imagine South Fellowship 2,000 years from now still being here until we all got deported? That's kind of weird. All right. So it's in the middle of all that we imagine being a Christian in the first century. So now let's make it personal. You're a follower of Jesus, and you're a person who attends the church at Thyatira. And chances are you work in the trades. And in order to work in the trades, you had to be a part of a trade guild. And that's how you made your living. That's how you provided for your family, which meant that you had to make a choice. Do I engage in the guild? It's all or none, baby. Or do I say, I'm not going to be a part of that and risk losing income and providing for your family? In 2008, I moved to Chicago and had some great pizza, that's true, some great sandwiches, but an experience I had never experienced before. I was driving through this neighborhood, and there was a new housing addition being built. And there was an inflatable rat, like huge, 12 feet tall or so, on the side of the street corner. And there were these two guys sitting in chairs with like protest signs. And it looked a lot like this. Anyone ever seen one of these rats? So I didn't know what that was. I thought it's a weird way to draw attention to get people to buy your house. And then as I started exploring, I realized what was happening is that the two people that were sitting there were people who were a part of a local labor union, who had been sent out, paid to protest that the builder that was building this home, the homes in this housing addition, was using not all union employees. They were using outside the union employees to do this. And their hope was to influence people, to influence the builder. You must use labor union employees only, or to convince people you shouldn't buy from this guy because he's using non-labor employees. I had a friend who was a paint contractor, really, really, really good at what he does. And he had all these jobs that he would put bids in for. And he'd get all the way through the bid process, had the best prices, great references, all this kind of stuff. And then they'd get to the end of the process, and the person would say, well, we want to sign a contract with you. Wait, you're union, right? And he'd go, no, I'm not, but I can do great work. And they go, I'm not getting a rat outside my store, man. So I'm sorry, I can't hire you. So you can imagine how difficult it would be for a Christian in the first century, having to pay pay for groceries and food for their kids and to provide for their family and having to make a terrible choice. Do I fully participate in what's happening with the union, or do I not participate and risk losing it all? That's the world of the church at Thyatira. And with that, let's take a look at Revelation chapter 2. We're going to start in verse 18. This is a long letter, so bear with me. We're going to read this, and then we're going to unpack it together. Revelation 2, chapter 2, verse 18. To the angel of the church in Thyatira write, these are the words of the Son of God, whose eyes are like blazing fire, and whose feet are like burnished bronze. I know your deeds, your love and faith, your service and perseverance, and that you now are doing more than you did at first. Nevertheless, this I have against you. You tolerate that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophet. By her teaching, she misleads my servants into sexual immorality and the eating of food sacrificed to idols. I've given her time to repent of her immorality, but she's unwilling, and so I will cast her on a bed of suffering, and I will make those who commit adultery with her suffer intensely, unless they repent of her ways. I will strike her children dead. Then all the churches will know that I am he who searches hearts and minds, and I will repay each of you according to your deeds. Now, I say to the rest of you in Thyatira, to those who do not hold to her teaching and have not learned Satan's so-called deep secrets, I will not impose any other burden on you, except to hold on to what you have until I come. To the one who is victorious and does my will to the end, I will have authority given to them over the nations. That one will rule them with an iron scepter and will dash them to pieces like pottery. Just as I have received authority from my Father, I will also give that one the morning star. And then he ends the way he ends all of the letters. Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. This is the word of the Lord. Wow, that is some nice, light, easy reading. Next date night, just an idea. Open a bottle of wine, start a fire, and read this together. I mean, it is really amazing. He started off with some really recognizable language in the very first part of this. He says three things that kind of stick out to me. The first one that first century readers would recognize is this idea of like eyes like blazing fire. It was a reference to the biblical book of Daniel. And it was Daniel having this image of a future Messiah to come with eyes like this. So he was claiming a little bit of messiahship, which he does later in the letter as well. Then he also talks about the phrase son of God, not sons of God. And it was common in the first century for many people to believe in this idea that the rulers of the day were sons of gods. So Jesus was saying, I'm son of God. And then the last thing is he calls out to feet like what? Bronze, which would have stuck out to everyone because bronze making was a huge part of culture in that day. So Jesus started off this letter basically saying, I need you to understand that it's not the local gods, it's not your business, it's not all these other things that have authority. I'm the one who has authority. And then he turns and he praises them for what they were doing that was great. And I have to be honest, a few months ago when Ryan said, would you teach this weekend? I thought, cool, let me go read it. I started off the first verse, okay, claiming his authority, not a problem. Second verse, he's like, let me tell you, you guys are awesome. You're doing this awesome stuff. And then he goes on to say, you're growing, like you're getting better than you were in the beginning. I'm like, I could preach this. This is really good. Then I read the next verse and I was like, I do not want to preach this. I do not want to preach this. So he lodges this complaint about this person Jezebel, and it's probably not true that Jezebel was the name of this person, but she was doing things, a type of a person we see in the Old Testament. Jezebel was the wife of Ahab, and she led her people and Ahab to worship the god Baal and to turn their backs on God. And so clearly there was some woman in the Thyatiran church who was abusing her leadership power to convince some of the people at Thyatira just to go ahead and do what everybody in the guilds are doing. And the reason she was able to justify this, and this is what I think her teaching was this Gnostic idea. It was a heretical early concept in the church that basically said your body and your spirit are separate. Meaning, do whatever you want in your body. It doesn't affect your relationship with Christ. And so she was saying, go into the temple. It's okay. Eat food, sacrifice to idols, have sex with other people. Just don't mean it in your heart, and it's okay. And that's what she was telling people. And so then, as a response, we turn a corner and we see some of the harshest language we see in the New Testament from Jesus. And essentially, by using language like, I'm going to throw her on her sick bed, I'm going to put an end to her and kill her children, he's basically just saying, I'm going to put an end to her and the fruit of her work. I'm not going to allow it to happen anymore. And then he encourages those who hold fast to not give over. But the big question in all of this, it's a heavy chapter. There's a lot of content there. And for Bible nerds, we could dive into this, and there's all kinds of cool little things we could pick apart. But the big question I have is, what's really going on here? What's happening here? At first glance, it'd be easy to look at it and say, well, it's clearly about sexual immorality and eating food sacrificed to idols. That seems obvious. But I want to look back at verse 20, and let's just look together to see what's really going on in this letter. Look at verse 20. I have this against you. You've tolerated that woman Jezebel, who's a self-anointed prophetess, and who misleads my followers to commit immoral sexual acts and to eat food prepared for idol worship. So were sexual immorality and food sacrificed to idols, were those a problem? Of course. Were they mentioned? Yeah, but they're way down in the text. Notice the key word here. What sticks out? The word what? Tolerate. It's that the people of the church did what? They tolerated. Another way of saying it is they had such apathy. The church was just filled with apathy. Apathy towards what? Toward a leader who abused her influence to do what? To lead people astray. Astray into what? Well, into compromising their faith. Why? So that they'd fit in. That's what's really going in this passage, in this letter. See what I'm saying? So they tolerated it. This leader led people into stuff that Jesus knew would ultimately hurt them and move them away from wholeness. And that's what he said, I have against you. And so what we see is this harsh reaction. And I think we see such a harsh reaction because Jesus had to step in because they failed to step in. And he knew that they had made two critical mistakes by not mirroring the heartbeat of God. The first mistake, I think, is that they had failed to realize that the mission of Jesus, as Jesus was calling people to himself, why did he do that? To move them toward wholeness. We might call that discipleship. If they'd been committed to the wholeness of everyone in their community, they never would have tolerated watching someone making choices and getting led astray into stuff that would lead them toward a path that's not wholeness. And then the second thing I think they did that was their mistake and why Jesus had to step in is because they didn't work to keep things that could bring shame upon the church or cause the church to lose its voice at such an important time. They didn't work to keep those things out. They were apathetic. They tolerated it. So to sort of frame the rest of our discussion, I'm gonna throw out a big idea, and I would love it if you just write this down because we're going to talk about this over and over. But I think it's really important because this reflects the heartbeat of God, but it also should reflect the heartbeat of us and our church as well. Here's the big idea. Jesus is fiercely committed to the wholeness of his people and the influence of his church. Would you say that with me? Jesus is fiercely committed to the wholeness of his people and the influence of his church. That means that Jesus is committed to helping people move and grow toward being in his image. But he's also committed to the church being the vehicle of carrying the gospel message and for transformation, for the church to be a light shining in the darkness. And he will do whatever it takes to make sure that happens. And I think we see that really clearly in this chapter. That's our starting place, and that's the framework we're going to unpack together in two parts. The first half of that, Jesus is fiercely committed to the wholeness of his people. Remember at the end of Matthew, what's commonly called the Great Commission? What was that all about? Jesus was telling the disciples, I want you to go to the ends of the earth. I want you to make disciples of all nations. And do what? And teach them to obey everything that I've commanded you. Well, what's the point? Well, I would argue that the point of all of that is wholeness. It's a person becoming a whole human being. As a matter of fact, I would argue that the incarnation was Jesus. One thing we learned from the incarnation was Jesus showing us how to be a whole human being. That there had been brokenness introduced into humanity. And Jesus was showing us the picture of God and the picture of what his desire is to pull us toward being like himself. And I think sometimes we mistake discipleship for accumulating information. I'm a learner type. My wife gets on to me because I have way too many books. I love to learn. My office here at church is right next door to another nerd learner. I don't want to say any names, but he looks like Phil Rosenthal. We have a lot of books, and that's great. And in my 20s, my expression as a pastor was running people through Bible studies, teaching them to memorize Scripture, having conversations about what the Bible says, theology. I have 2 master's degrees in theology. I'm a nerd. I get it. But I think I mistook information for transformation. And then it became a real problem for me when I did all of this work and someone would come to me and their marriage was in trouble or their life was still a wreck. So what happens when discipleship, our model of discipleship, is teaching people all of these things, but it doesn't change them on the inside? I've come to realize that's a pretty narrow view of discipleship. And I think the pattern we see from Jesus is inviting people into something way deeper. One of the most beautiful pictures that I think we see in the Gospels is this moment when Jesus meets with this woman, the Samaritan woman at the well. Remember the story? Jesus goes, asks this lady to give him a drink. And what's really interesting is this woman had turned to all of the wrong things to try to meet her need inside. And she had many husbands and was divorced and was living with this guy. And by all accounts, her life was in trouble. And so Jesus sits with her, and what does he do? Well, you guys know the story. He launches a Bible study, and he gives her 13 passages to memorize. And he said, if you'll just remember these, your life's going to be much better. And then he took an offering. No, that is not what he did. Let's look at what he did. He said this to her, John chapter 4, verse 13. Drink this water, that's the water that she was pulling from the well. It's good water. And your thirst will be quenched only for a moment, meaning you get it and it's good, but you're going to get thirsty again. And then you have to keep coming back to this well. I offer water that will become a wellspring within you that gives life throughout eternity. And you'll never be thirsty again. That's beautiful. I mean, he did not invite her to just serve him and to keep coming back to the well. He invited her to partake of living water, which was who? Himself. And instead of beating her up and doing what most people in that day would do, and beating her up and shaming her and guilting her, he asked her the truth. He spoke to the truth, didn't he? You say you have no husband. That's true. You've actually had 5 husbands. And then he called her toward something even better, which was a picture of wholeness. I'm going to help you become like me, and you won't need this water. You're going to have life for all of eternity. That's beautiful. He called her to take steps toward wholeness. What's wholeness? Well, one way maybe you could kind of look at it as this model where wholeness is someone that's becoming healthy and whole physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, relationally. I would even argue financially and vocationally. So people who spend 30 years working a job they hate, they're not growing in wholeness in that area and living out wholeness, the obedience to Jesus, even in their work. And so when we talk about discipleship and helping others, I think we make a big mistake when we don't take the whole person into account. I think we should be discipling the whole person and inviting them to be transformed by the gospel in such a way that they're growing in all of those areas. And the big $10,000 seminary word that describes all of this is sanctification. That's a word that just means you're becoming more like Jesus. And who is Jesus? A whole human being. Not just learn ourselves, that's an important part of us, but all the rest of us matters too. And essentially that means that we as Christians have to look at other people and we have to start, our starting place has to be Genesis 1 and the early part of Genesis 2. Often I think the church gets it wrong by focusing exclusively on the fall. What is a term that I've come to really, I don't like this term, original sin. And the reason I don't like it, even though I know it's true that sin was entered into all humanity, is that we've forgotten in the first part of Genesis that God created all of these things. And what did God say? It was good. And it's a huge theological mistake, in my opinion, to start with how we see other people with original sin and forget about original blessing. And so for us as a church, as the people of God, we have to start with this mindset that yes, the person in front of me might be presented as a broken person. Who's not? But is that the end of their story? Is that what we saw Jesus do? Absolutely not. Jesus called that person toward wholeness. Here at South, we kind of say this a lot. What are we all about? Well, we're all about helping people live in the way of Jesus with the heart of Jesus. And what is the end result? Wholeness. That's why we do what we do. That's why we have gatherings like this. That's why we have children's and students ministry, and why we put a lot of money into serving people around the world. It's not just so that we can feel good about having a big church. It's because we really, really, really care about this idea of helping people live in the way of Jesus with the heart of Jesus. We so closely want to mirror God's heartbeat on this that we are organizing everything we do around this. And I think it's things like that that keep us from being an apathetic church. And I got to say, if our starting place wasn't this, if we, listen church, if we lose this, we'll end up in the same place that Thyatira does. An apathetic church that doesn't give a rip. What's really interesting is I don't think we have to look too far in our culture right now to see examples of what happens when apathy toward leaders abusing their power. Well, we don't have to look very far. Unless you've lived under a rock for the last 6 months, or you were wise and said, I'm not watching the news anymore, which I've thought about giving up numerous times. Unless you've done that, you would see that. We've all seen these horror stories in the news these past several months of powerful leaders who abuse their power to sexually harass and abuse others. Haven't we seen that? And it's everywhere from the entertainment industry to politicians to athletes to, I can't even tell you, like the last 3 or 4 months, it seems like every week I find another teacher that was sleeping with their student. Here's what blows my mind as I think about this. In most of these cases, not all, but in most of these cases, there were tons of people that knew what was going on and they weren't surprised and they didn't say anything. And I just have to say, as a pastor, to myself and to this church and to the Christian community, what kind of culture do we live in where women have to sleep with their boss to keep their job or fear losing their job? And a lot of people know about this and no one says anything. See, the apathy at Thyatira happens when people are apathetic toward leaders just doing their own thing and abusing their power. And you might not like this, but there are, when the church is silent and when people are silent and people in organizations are silent, movements spring up like Me Too movement. And what we see is a bunch of women saying, this has got to stop, and this can't happen anymore. But what's really interesting about this is, by and large, the church has been silent on these issues. I don't understand that. Because I think rooted in the gospel and rooted in leadership, and leadership isn't just a bunch of paid people on staff, it's you and me. This is our church. Here's what I know to be true. Unhealthy leadership leads toward pain. Unhealthy leadership leads people toward pain, but healthy leadership leads people toward wholeness. And my conviction, church, is that Christians should be the loudest voices in our society, holding up a banner saying, that's not okay, but you are okay, because people matter, and they matter to Jesus, and they should be advocates. Instead of abdicating our responsibility, we should advocate in love and show people what wholeness looks like and be a positive, healthy voice for Jesus to pull people in that direction. Amen. That's my conviction. Amen. That means we have to start with dignity and Jesus' desire for the wholeness of others. And when we don't do that, we run the risk of other people becoming objects to us or dehumanizing them or condemning them because they're not like us. And that leads to apathy. And when we are apathetic, it leads to hurting brothers and sisters and ignoring them instead of, or judging them, instead of lovingly coming alongside and pointing them towards a better story, pointing them towards wholeness. And so the way we avoid that is we start with this view that people are made in the image of God. And though they might be broken, and though that image might be, as Scott McKnight says, somewhat distorted, they're worthy of love and taking steps toward wholeness. I love a few months ago we had Dr. Jeff Brodsky come and was sharing about these girls that he's working relentlessly to get off the streets. And the reason he does that is because he starts from this premise that they're beautiful and made in God's image. I love that. I love that there are people at South that so firmly believe that people are made in God's image and deserve a chance to move toward wholeness, that they're willing to foster conversations about refugees. I love that there are people in South who give of their time and their energy and their money to serve in our city and to partner with other organizations who believe in human dignity and are holding up a banner for wholeness and orienting their lives around helping people take steps in that way. And I think about the people of South who give up vacation time and money to travel around the world, to meet with cultures that are very different from them, to remind them that they're made in God's image, and to call them to take steps toward wholeness, to becoming who God created them to be. Last service, I had someone come up to me at the very end, and I thought I had it on me, but I don't, I guess. But she had a little card that said, "You matter," a little business-sized card. She keeps a stack of those. And she said she just gives them out all the time at restaurants or the person serving her at this place or that. And she's literally seen people burst into tears because sometimes that's the only time they hear those words. So to me, why not let us as the church, as followers of Jesus, start with wholeness, and let's make that our hashtag, you matter. To say to people, you matter. Your life matters. Jesus died so you could have life because you matter. Why? Because remember, Jesus is fiercely committed to the wholeness of his people. And my prayer is that we never lose sight of that. Let's talk about the second thing that Jesus is fiercely committed to. Jesus is fiercely committed to what? The influence of his church. Imagine if you had discovered this cure for cancer in a pill. Not only was it a cure for cancer that is existing, it's a vaccine against cancer. That's kind of an amazing deal. And out of your heart, you wanted to give this to all of the people in the world, and you're going to give it away for free. And so your strategy was, you thought, how could I tell as many people in my country about this all at once? And you kind of know that I think tonight, there's a big basketball game or something happening, I don't know. But anyway, it's high school football championships, I'm not sure. But imagine if during the Super Bowl, you decided your strategy was, I'm going to put all my eggs in this basket. I'm going to spend the gazillion dollars it is to get a 1-minute ad. And I'm going to tell everybody, I've discovered the cure from cancer or a vaccine to keep you from getting it. All you have to do is take this pill. It's for free, and all I need you to do is go to my website. That's my strategy. Go to my website, sign up for it, 3 to 5 business days, bam, in your mailbox, take this pill, all is good. And imagine if that was your strategy, and when it was time to air, a group like Anonymous or some other hacking organization had hacked your website and just put up a splash screen that just said, "Gotcha, suckers." How would you feel about that? Not very good. You guys are looking at me like, I don't know how I would feel about that. I can see you. I don't know if you realize that. Here's what I would do. I would be really angry because I put all my eggs in the basket. I was offering life to people, and someone else sabotaged that. And I think it's important to remember that Jesus' vehicle for the expansion of the gospel was a church planting movement that started with 12 disciples that he sent into all the nations. And he didn't want anything to get in the way of the church having a voice for the gospel in the midst of a broken society. And we see this with Peter. He says this to Peter, "This is why I've called you Peter, the rock, for on this rock I will build my church. The church will reign triumphant, even at the gates of hell." Think about it. Jesus' heart is that the church would be filled with whole human beings who proclaimed the good news of Jesus Christ and invited others to live in the way of Jesus with the heart of Jesus. And the problem in Thyatira is that they didn't really care about wholeness all that much. Obviously, they tolerated this. But the ultimate consequence of that, and Jesus knew this, is by letting it fester, it could ruin the voice of the whole church. Make sense? Because outside people who are trapped in this cycle look at the church and would see, I don't see anything different about those guys. And Jesus wasn't okay with that. Now, at first glance you might go, well, it was just a few people in the church, not a real big deal. But Jesus understood that sometimes just tolerating those little things can blow up and can rob a church of its influence. When I was in high school, I went over to some friend's house from the youth group, and we sat down and we started watching this movie, this Mel Gibson movie. And there's probably 15, 20 of us crammed in their living room. We were watching this movie. And as it was going on, there were a number of swear words. And the dad who was there, he came in and he listened for a couple of minutes. And then he walked right over and turned off the TV. And he said, "You guys aren't watching this anymore." And it kind of ticked us off. We're like, "Hey, man, this is a good movie. We're watching this. Why can't we watch it?" And he was like, "Well, I'm not going to have in my house all these young, impressionable minds watching a movie with all these swear words. And we're like, it's just a handful, it's not a big deal. And he thought for a moment and he said, let me ask you a question. If I baked a pan of brownies, how many of you would eat those brownies? And I would just pose that to you. If you have a pulse and you're a follower of Jesus, the answer is, I would eat the brownies, correct? Do we have a brownie-hating church? Like, are you guys? Okay, there's one guy right here really likes the brownies. So, of course, we're like, well, absolutely, we're eating those brownies. And then, in his words, he said, if I went outside and I picked up 3 or 4 dog turds, that's what he called them, and I put them in the brownies, just 3 or 4, would you eat the brownies? What's your answer? No. Probably not. He goes, okay, how about if I just put like 1 or 2? Would you eat the brownies? He said, what if I just pulverize them a little bit and just a light dusting? Just a light dusting, a doo-doo dusting, maybe we'd call it. Would you eat the brownies? No. Why? Because it ruined the brownies. So it's kind of a funny story, but it's stuck with me for over 20 years, this idea that a little bit of unhealthy stuff can ruin the whole batch. And the church at Thyatira wasn't willing to speak up for that, and they had lost their voice. Another way, just really quick, we see that causes the church and Christians to lose their voice is because they're known more for what they're against than what they're for. I'm going to give you a great example of this with this picture. There's a church in Kansas. I don't want to say their name because I don't want to give them the dignity of that, but it rhymes with Lestboro. And go ahead and put the picture up. This is what we see in the news. How many of you guys have seen the news reporting on these guys protesting at soldiers' funerals or churches? We got an email, a security alert probably 2 months ago, that they were coming to Denver and they were picketing 3 different churches. And they used really harsh language. God hates adultery. They say God hates fags. You're going to burn in hell, all these sorts of things. Isn't that interesting? Here's what I will tell you. I really don't know what they're for. But I can tell you really quickly what they're against. But if I put myself in the shoes of someone who doesn't know Jesus, who desperately needs someone to put them on a path toward wholeness, does this church have a voice in their ear? No. What do people think when they see this? Hate. Is that the image and reflection of Jesus? When I lived in Oklahoma and we had tornadoes, they would pick the most backwoods redneck person to get on the news and to talk about this in painful detail. I mean, Cletus would come out in his overalls, coveralls. I was down in South 40 down there. I was working on my tractor. She was broken down. I tell you, I looked and I saw a funnel. Ma, there's a funnel cloud coming down there. We best get to sell it. I'm from Oklahoma, and I'm going, I don't identify with this person at all. I'm just saying. So then, when you watch the news, and CNN is reporting Westboro is coming, they're talking about all this, but what I don't see very often, I always want to go, could I get on TV and say, I'm a follower of Jesus, and I have absolutely nothing in common with these guys? This is not an image and reflection of Jesus. I want to hear more of us saying things like that, because we lose our voice when we do that. So if we're going to be a church that has a voice, I'm just going to give you 3 things we should do to be a church that has a voice, that does not become apathetic, that does not turn into the church at Thyatira. The first one is we got to be a safe place for broken, hurting people. That's really important. You know, some churches make it really uncomfortable for people who are hurting or far from God. Maybe the way that they dress or just their language or just talking a lot about hell and sin and how bad people are. I was at a church a few years ago with my family, and there were these children getting baptized, which is a really special thing. And I loved the format that they did. They brought these kids in and they recorded them kind of telling their journey, why they wanted to be baptized, and then they baptized them in front of the church. And that's a beautiful thing in theory. But out of 3 or 4 of these 5, 6, 7-year-old kids, the common theme was this. I'm a bad person, and I want Jesus to take the bad away. That's why I'm getting baptized. And it broke my heart. I don't want my kids listening to that theology every week, that they're bad. I want it to be where we know we've got our challenges, but the church throws their arms wide and says to people, we love you for who you are and not for who you're supposed to be. I love that the people of South, it's a welcoming church. We're a welcoming church, right? Yes. I love that on Tuesday nights we have Celebrate Recovery. It's just an environment for people with hurts, habits, and hang-ups to take steps toward wholeness in community. I love that there are churches who work really hard to, when people sort of fall in ways, they start having a hard time. They don't just say to them, oh, let me just judge you and kick you while you're down. They say, come on, brother or sister, come on back. Let's move toward wholeness. I love that churches like Saddleback Church in Southern California, they're advocating for people with mental health issues. They're not running from it. Historically, the churches put that at arm's length, and they're wide open. They're pioneering ways to help people with mental health issues. And I think that is absolutely beautiful. And listen to this. Saying we love you as you are, not as you should be, is one of the most powerful messages we can communicate. And I think that's what we see in Jesus with the woman at the well, with the woman caught in adultery who everyone wanted to stone. Consistently, the message of Jesus is, I love you as you are, not as you should be. Now come with me, and let's take a step toward wholeness. The second thing a church can do to be a voice that makes an impact and has an influence is to be a voice for those who don't have a voice. Isn't it interesting? There's been such an absence of the American Christian church for some reason, speaking to these issues and reminding women that they're valued and that they are made in God's image and that they matter. I had two young ladies come up to me after the first service and just thank me for speaking about this and reminding people that they matter. Why aren't more people doing that? It shouldn't be a foreign thing, right? There are people who don't, for whatever reason, have a voice. The church that has influence is the church that gets up and speaks for the marginalized and the poor and the oppressed. And let me just tell you, an unbelieving world looks at things like Westboro and are turned off. But they look at a church who has the guts to stand up and speak God's truth and to call people toward wholeness. And they listen to that voice because it's so unusual for them to hear that. I'm impressed that some people I know, they are leading the church to have a voice around the fact that there are Christians in northern Iraq and in Syria who are in prison camps. And their life is awful. And they were reminding us, you and me, and the church, that we should be for these people and do something about it. I have a friend who goes into all of these countries, some communist countries even, to advocate for the rights of people who are oppressed even by their government. He's been arrested countless times. But he's doing his best to be a voice for people who don't have a voice. And I think credibility in the church is when the church will stand up and speak to injustices that they see. But the problem is, if all we ever do is speak to those injustices, and we don't ever speak to what's good, people don't want to hear us. And that leads me to the third thing. The third thing we can do to be a church that has a voice is to call out goodness and beauty when we see it. There are a lot of churches that call out what's wrong with culture. I used to attend this church with my family, and it felt like every sermon the pastor would have this refrain, oh, we see in society and culture. Culture and society, the big, bad society and culture. And it's almost like some people think we should just hide in the cave and just wait for Jesus to come back. That culture is just awful. And that's the dominant narrative for so many people. And I get the need to lovingly show people, don't do this. This is not what you should do. I get it. But I think it's also really important that we have an eye toward what's good and what's beautiful. And I imagine, what would it be if the people of this church, what if you and I, if we got out of these church walls and we got involved in the things that make up the heartbeat of our city? Things like education or the arts or one of my favorite, local food or the neighborhoods that we live in. And instead of simply being known as that church that complains about everything that's wrong in culture and society, instead of seeing those things as a nuisance, what if we started having eyes toward God's goodness and beauty being nestled right down in the middle of it? A few years ago, I got an opportunity to go to Bangkok, Thailand, to serve a church that was struggling for about 8 days. And before I went, I had a whole bunch of people come up to me and just say, wow, I'm going to be praying for you. Bangkok's such a dark, dark place. You can feel it's like a thick blanket of sinister oppression. There's nothing good about Bangkok. And I thought about it, and in some ways they're right. There's a lot of darkness in Bangkok. You might not know this, but there are thousands of women entrapped in the sex trade in Bangkok. But I chose to go with a different set of eyes because I wanted to see, well, where's God moving in the midst of this? It can't just be that there's just this pocket in the earth that's just the, Gehenna that we throw our junk in and forget about. That can't be true. So let me go with maybe fresh eyes. And I chose to go looking for the goodness and beauty of God. And I had a completely different experience than many of the people who talked to me. Everywhere I looked, I saw God's goodness and beauty in the midst of some dark places. I saw this little bitty church of 50 to 100 people that was having a huge impact at loving the neighbors in their city. I saw this woman from Shawnee, Oklahoma, who was 40 years old, had chosen not to marry, had ran from her life here to start this ministry in Bangkok, started a coffee shop to get ladyboys out of the sex trade and to give them a skill and to give them a chance to start a new life and move toward wholeness. I saw musicians playing on the street corners, and I saw artists painting in beautiful places. I went to the slums in Bangkok where the king had given these people property to live on, and they had nothing, zero. They had little shanties, little shacks that they lived in, and I had to be sort of struck by this idea that they were happier about life than I usually am. God was in their midst. I saw a restaurant owner from America who started a restaurant, cooked really great food, created a great experience, just so that people could experience goodness and beauty. And I think if it's true what the scriptures say, that every good gift comes from the Father, then that must mean that all of those good things, even when they seem little at the time, they must be from God. So it's there. You see, the church, instead of having eyes only toward the negative and calling out the problems in our culture as all negative, I think the church that has influence does speak to injustice. But that also doesn't mean that we throw people who are committing injustice just under the bus as there's no good in you either. Because they also have a plan. Jesus wants to pull them toward wholeness too. But it also means that the church is calling out goodness and beauty where we see it and helping people tell a better story. Imagine if we were the kind of church made up of people who actively supported local businesses. What if today, instead of going to the chain restaurant, those are good, but what if you went to just a little mom and pop store and supported those people today? What if we got involved in our local city? What if we started mentoring young leaders? And most importantly, what if in the midst of all that, we surprised people by celebrating where we see God's goodness and beauty shining brightly? Kind of an experience that I don't like very much is when I'm out in my town, and there's this, how we get to know each other, and what's the question we always ask each other? What do you do? I don't like that moment because the word pastor is very loaded for a lot of people. I once heard Erwin McManus say that telling someone you're a pastor is like telling them you're a cannibal and inviting them over for dinner. So a lot of people by default assume that I'm one of those Westboro type judgmental Christians who's waiting to pounce. And I'm just a guy who loves Jesus and believes Jesus wants to work in their life just as much as mine. I'd rather talk about what's good and call people toward wholeness. And people seem really surprised when you start doing that, and they listen. And here's the thing. The only way we can have a church like this that's not apathetic, that honors wholeness, that honors the impact of the church in the city is by us all committing to co-creating this together. Remember Thyatira, the way that they protected their city is they locked arms together. But it wasn't so locked that things couldn't come in. Remember, they were one of the leading trade cities in the region. So they had to let what's good in, but they kept what was bad out. And that's what I think is a great picture of the church. I think, yes, we have to keep those things that can hurt the church out, but we must never do that at the expense of letting people who desperately need Jesus in, and at the expense of us going into the city to be a voice of hope. It's not we hide in this room. It's we're recharging our batteries in here, and we're reaffirming our commitment to the wholeness and the dignity and people being made in the image of God, and then we go, and we love our cities. And if we see our brother or our sister making a misstep, what I would love for outsiders to see is us just lovingly pulling them along, not kicking them when they're down. And I would love it if we see things in our culture that are injustice, leaders abusing their power, that we would stand up and say, it's not just you two, we're with you. Why? Because you matter. And I would love to see a church that's committed to calling out goodness and beauty when we see it. And friends, that's the kind of church that has a voice in our broken world today. So I want to remind us of our big idea, and I want to add one piece to it. Jesus is fiercely committed to the wholeness of all people, or his people, and the influence of his church. And then I want to amend it by tacking on one last thing. And we should be too. Say that with me. And we should be too. We should care about the wholeness in people and the impact of others because Jesus cares. And that's what we take away from the second chapter of Revelation in the letter to Thyatira. Imagine if every person who attends this church took this seriously. Imagine if it's not just the paid people, right? There's not enough of us to go around. Imagine if you and me and all of us, we took this seriously and started really focusing on calling people toward wholeness, who God made them to be. And we co-created together. We worked to co-create this church that was the kind of church people want to attend, but also as a voice of love and grace, but also truth in the midst of a city with hurting people. And imagine if I did my part, and imagine if you did your part, what it might do to the marriages among us, what it might do to the families and the careers and the neighborhoods and the businesses in our city, and on it goes. Imagine if we took our personal responsibility seriously, what it would do to the people God's placed in our path. And imagine if we got involved with the cities God placed us in. We started looking with fresh eyes, and we started calling out goodness and beauty where we see it. So that brings me to this question, what about you? We've been ending our study of these letters with just a handful of practices to help us to actually take what we've learned and to put it into some kind of action. And so what I'm going to ask you to do right now is just to take your hands like this and just hold them open. It's really hard to hear what the Spirit might be saying when we have clenched fists. But with your hands open, I want you just to look at these three as I sort of lay them out and ask God, what practice do you want me to put in place this week? For some of us, it's being intentional as we encounter people this week to remember that they're made in God's image. For some of us, what if that was our thought as we looked at the person who was our barista, or at our children, or at the person in the cube next to us at work? What if we just, or the person who cut us off in traffic? That's hard. But what if our attitude this week was, I'm going to try to live with eyes of encountering people, just a little quick reminder that they're made in God's image. For some of us, that's the practice. For others of us, the practice is for us to practice looking for goodness and beauty in our surroundings. And maybe what that means is that on your way home today, you drive a different route. Instead of the same well-worn path that you take and you tune it all out, what if you drive through a neighborhood you're not used to driving through? What if you drive through the downtown of wherever your particular city is? What if today you eat lunch at a different place and you say to your server and to the people who own that restaurant, here's what was great today? What would that do as you learn to call out goodness and beauty? And finally, for all of us to give some thought to what our part is toward making this a life-giving community for those who aren't here yet. Over 1,000 people a month are moving into this area. We want to be that kind of church with our arms open wide, saying there's a place for you. So the question is, what's your part? And what's my part? We're going to move into something that I think is one of the most beautiful pictures of what the church should look like, and that is communion. And what a better way to remind us that Jesus came and died for all and was committed toward wholeness than to gather around this table. And I love this table because it's all different kinds of people. All different kinds of people come to this table. Different backgrounds. Maybe they make more or less than you. They have a different skin color than you. They grew up in a different side of the tracks than you. But I love that we all get to gather around this. And so what I want to do before we start communion is I want you to look around this room. Bend your necks, turn around, look at the people in this room. This is your community. This is the church at South. And listen, some of these people are like you. Some of these are not like you. Some of these people don't like you. But I'm going to tell you, what's common about all of this is that we are all made in the image of God. and the heartbeat of Jesus Christ is to pull people toward wholeness. And so we're going to do something a little bit different. This is your community. It's not my community. It's not Ryan's, it's not our elders or our staff's community. It's our community, and we co-create the goodness of God together. So we're going to do something a little bit different. We have 7 stations around the room. Just come to the station nearest you. And what I want you to do is to come to the front, and they're going to have someone waiting to serve you. But what I want you to do is I want you to take the elements. You're going to take the juice and the wafer, and I want you to take these from the person and allow them to take the elements. And then they're going to take it right there. You're not going to wait to go back to your seat. You're going to take the elements. And then I want you to turn around and hand it to the person behind you. And then you take your elements. And go ahead and partake. I want you to step out of the right side of your aisle, come to the front, take the trays, serve the person in front of you, turn around and allow the person behind you to serve you, and then go back to your seats. And to me, this is a beautiful picture of us co-creating that community together. You don't have to be a pastor to give communion to someone else. This is a table that Jesus has invited us to. On the night that Jesus was betrayed, he took the bread and he broke it. And he told the disciples, he said, "This is my body broken for you. Eat this in remembrance of me." And then he took the wine and he poured it out for them. And he said, "This is my blood shed for you. Drink this in remembrance of me." And to me, this is a beautiful picture where we get to remember those things. The person of Jesus, what Jesus has done, but also we're in this together. And this is your tribe. So come to the front, take the tray from the person in front of you, and serve them. Turn around, give the tray to the person behind you, let them serve you, and go back to your seats. Let's partake in communion together. Let's come.